Match of the Day, as you probably all know, is a football highlights programme screened by the BBC on Saturday nights during the Premier League season. Saying that, I have never ever watched it. So just don't judge me on that, please. It is one of the BBC's longest running shows, and according to the Guinness World Records, the longest running football television programme. Now, as I said, it's a football highlights programme, which means that if you watch it, you will just see that. Highlights of the important games of the afternoon, the goals being scored. And of course, if you watch normal matches, they're nothing like that. You might be very disappointed because building up to these very significant moments are lots of other stuff, which unless you're a true football fan, you might not appreciate. Now, on top of these, there are also highlights programs, which I believe Seth watches, which is the 10 worst fouls, and there are loads and loads of YouTube videos of special highlights of certain kinds from all sorts of matches. And you realise quickly, when you've seen all about this, that they've really got nothing to do, or not much to do with real football games. Now, when we're approaching the Bible, we might be tempted to focus, and some people do, on the parts we find the most interesting, the highlights which bring us comfort, solace, and encouragement. But if that's all we ever look at, we will miss the great many things that God wants us to know and that we need to know. Things that we perhaps might not want to hear. But on top of that, if in addition to this, if this is all we are willing to engage with, our view of God will be distorted. Our view of the Christian life will be distorted. And it will ultimately lead us to either be very disappointed with our experiences because they don't match up to the highlights that we're focused on, or perhaps even worse, get deluded by convincing ourselves that we live this 24/7, every moment special experience. Now, in our study of the book of Acts, we have come to realise that it's not just a personal memoir of Luke's reminiscences. It's not even a narrative and history of the early church. It's much more than that. It's a careful selection of the key events of the early church. And Luke records these, of course, for our benefit. But as well as this, one of these big events, these what we used to call the most important moments, the paradigm shifts, there's other stuff being played out. And Luke is describing the stage on which they are played, describing what is happening in the background. And so he provides for the context of what the Christian church was going through at the time, and actually is the background to all the epistles of Paul. And so from these we learn the what, when, how, where, who of the early church and how it operated and grew. Now, so if we wish at Ponsbury to be like a New Testament church, then we've got much to learn from Luke's story. Now, as I said, we focus so much on the big issues, the most important events. And so you're going to ask me, so what is the big event today, Rob? Well, I'm going to have to say there isn't one. And what we're going to hear is ordinary and it is normal. There's not much spectacular. There's nothing spectacular going on. There's nothing extraordinary going on. But nevertheless, God is at work, working through the ordinary things of life in quite ordinary ways. And in fact, throughout Acts, God is working as much in the ordinary events as he is in the spectacular. So if you want a title for the sermon, it would be this: God working in the ordinary. And for us today, we might feel our lives are very ordinary. You might not, but I think for most of us, we all feel that what we do is not particularly important. We're not famous, we're not important, we're not doing anything extraordinary. But nevertheless, God uses us, he works in us, and he is present in the ordinary, in our normal circumstances, as he is in anything else. So last week, Mike told us about Paul's arrival and work at Corinth, which culminated in an attempt by the Jews there to get Paul into trouble with the local authorities. And we heard that it backfired very badly because the proconsul, Gallio, known in history as Lucius Annaeus Novatus, who was actually a friend of the Emperor Claudius, not only refused to actually engage with their representation, he got seriously annoyed with them and had them driven away from the court. And now we continue with the events that followed. So there two main sections. The first bit is Paul's journeys from Corinth and beyond, and there's an interlude introducing us to a man called Apollos. So we start in verse 18. Paul in a hurry. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he landed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. And so we read that after silencing the Jews, Paul continues with no fear, and whilst there's still hostility from the Jews of the place in Corinth, he's not intimidated, and he stays in Corinth a bit longer than he originally intended. In fact, he had no idea when he first came to Corinth he'd actually stay so long. But anyway, it just shows that Paul was willing to change his plans at will according to God's leading. And he did that because he recognized that this young church in Corinth really needed him there. It really needed his help in helping it grow, protecting it, and nurturing it. Paul the evangelist, he could have thought, my work's done there, I started a church, I'm off somewhere else. But if we understand Paul at all, and if we read the first letter to the Corinthians, we can understand why. Because he's anxious. He realizes this church is in a difficult and spiritually hostile environment, and he needs all the help, they need all the help he can give them. But he stays as long as he can, and now he has to leave. And he starts his journey accompanied by a couple who Mike introduced at the beginning of last week, Aquila and Priscilla. And we'll hear about them later. And he heads off to Antioch. Now, before leaving, he does something very strange. We might think it's strange. He shaves his head. At Cenchrea, which is one of the two ports, Corinth was on an isthmus. There's a narrow strip of land. It's probably only a few kilometres wide. It's called an isthmus. So there's sea on both sides of it. And Corinth had two ports. And the one on the east side was called Cenchrea. And just as they're leaving, Paul shaves his head. And it's done so because he's terminating a vow. Now, there's been a discussion about what kind of vow it was. Some say it was a Nazirite vow, where he abstained from strong drink for a particular season. But it doesn't look like it's that because the facts really don't fit it. If it had been a Nazirite vow, it would have been included in Jerusalem. It looks like it's something else, perhaps a private or personal promise that when Paul cut his hair marked the completion of that promise. And we think that vow, that promise must relate to his time in Corinth because that's when he left it. But why would he do it? And I think this is a bit disturbing because you think, Paul, you're kind of someone who talks about the New Covenant a lot. Why are you bringing in or thinking about these Jewish practices like vows and things? No, we don't actually know. Some people suggest it was carried out for the benefit of fellow Jews, to show that despite allegations against Paul, that he was anti-Jewish, he was anti their religion, that this was all false. Others suggest that actually Paul is signaling a time of gratitude. When he came to Corinth, he had a very rough time there. He was terrified when he got there. And we wonder whether he made a promise at that point. And now he's leaving Corinth. That remarks the conclusion of his phase there. And of course, because Paul was a Jew, that was his culture, that was his background. And that would be one of the ways, there's nothing wrong with it, from him expressing his devotion to God. But the take-home message, I think, in this is Paul kept his word. When he made promises, he kept them. And of course, as Christians today, when we make promises, we should keep them. So verse 19, they arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. And it was a customary stopping place from voyages from Greece to Syria. And Priscilla and Aquila had come that far as his travel companions. But that was as far as they were going. They were going no further. We know they'd stayed in Ephesus for several years, and they were either transferring their business for leather work from Corinth there, or leaving Corinth for good. And Maybe even they were leaving their business in Corinth in the hands of a branch manager. But Ephesus was one of the most important cities in Asia Minor. And its success was not simply, it was very rich, it was sat on the main trade route from Rome, but it was politically important as well. It was a seat of government for the province of Asia. It was a free Greek city with its own senate and assembly. And there's also a very large Jewish population there. In previous centuries, they had been given great privileges, which had been more recently confirmed not simply by the civic authorities, but by the emperor himself. So now finding himself in the capital of a region that up till now God had said, remember a few weeks ago, God said to him, you mustn't go into Asia. He now finds himself there. And so Paul does what he normally does. He makes use of every opportunity. And he goes into the synagogue because he hasn't given up on his fellow Jews. He hasn't abandoned them. He realized that God still has plans for them. And whilst they wished him to stay, Paul is on a timetable. He states, not in our version, but in the AV and other texts, it says, I must be at Jerusalem for a feast. And it's hidden in our text a bit, but it's present that Paul wanted to get to Jerusalem in time for a feast. The question is what feast it was, and we think it was, knowing that it was spring, it was probably the Passover. And knowing that actually sailing didn't start till the 10th of March in the Mediterranean because it was just too dangerous before then, he was leaving, really cutting it pretty fine because Passover would have been early April. So he promises, I'll be back if God will. And Paul didn't make promises. When he didn't make them, he kept them. He didn't make promises which he wasn't sure he could keep. So, verse 22, when he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem, greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. He landed at Caesarea, which was the Roman seat of government for the province and the largest port on the seaboard. And first he went up to Jerusalem, presumably there not simply for the Passover, but to meet the church there, the Jerusalem church. And then he went down to Antioch, which was a sending church on his missionary journeys. And after spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and travelled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And it just casually mentioned he pops off to Phrygia, but these are journeys where he's covering 1,500 miles. This is a time before aeroplanes, before cars, before buses, trains, or anything. And Luke just says, Paul just went there. Just reminds me when I was once at work and came back on Monday morning, saw my boss dump his bag and said, good weekend? Yes, I went to America. And he'd gone there for an interview and came back Monday morning after going Saturday. And Luke just drops these things as they're not important to him. They're not the important things that Luke is concentrating on. Now, we observe that Paul didn't stay long in Antioch because he's off again on what we would call his third missionary journey. But it's not really a missionary journey as such. He is visiting churches that he's already planted. He's not there to evangelize, but even though these churches have been ones he's founded, he's there to actually help them. And it demonstrates Paul really cares about people. He really cares for the churches he's planted. They weren't just a list of people who were converts to him, even just a list of people on a prayer list. These were people who he really anxiously cared about. Because if we read in Galatians, we read that this was a church which was under attack and in trouble. And Paul took every opportunity to go back to them to find out and see that they were all right. And not simply inquire, but to strengthen them, to build them up. Now we might ask, well, what did Paul do to strengthen them? Did he put them all on a bodybuilding course and take lots of collagen and creatine and these special protein diets? That's not the type of strengthening he's talking about. He is there to encourage them, to teach them so that they would grow in understanding and Christian maturity. He wouldn't always be around to protect them and combat compromising or false teaching, but he could ensure that they were equipped to deal with it when he wasn't around. He wasn't a hit-and-run evangelist who got his spiritual children up and running, then he was off. He was someone there to see them through the whole track. And so he taught them carefully so that they would be in a position to look after themselves. Now, we next come to our second phase. This was, I'd call, an introduction to Apollos. So it starts at verse 24. And it starts like this. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervour and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more perfectly. So we have what is quite a peculiar interlude. It seems to have not really much connection between what happened before and what happened afterwards, but it's interesting in its own right. We're introduced to a man named Apollos, or Apollonius, who is mentioned later in the epistles of Corinthians and Titus. And of course we meet Priscilla and Aquila again, who we just read had arrived in Corinth. Now, first we'll deal with Aquila and Priscilla. They were a bit more than countrymen and work friends, work companions of Paul. They were church leaders in their own right. They had a church in their house. Paul acknowledged them as having risked their lives for him. They were fellow workers in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it appears that they were already Christians when they met Paul. They were a mature and godly couple. And I'd like to feel an ultimate example of a fruitful Christian marriage. And they're always mentioned together. They served, worked, and endured together. Now, interestingly, in Paul's letters, Priscilla is introduced by a formal name, Prisca. And we don't know whether she was a Jew by birth, but often she is mentioned first. Some have suggested that she's connected to a noble Roman family and that she belonged to a higher social class than Aquila. But this wasn't a marriage where Aquila led the way with Aquila several steps behind him. It was a partnership where they were inseparable. It reminds me of the words of Tertullian, the early church father, who said, God did not make Eve out of Adam's head that she could think his thoughts, or from his feet that she could follow in his steps, but from his side so that she could be with him. Now, who was Apollos? He was a Jew by birth and education and born in Alexandria. Now, Alexandria was a very important city founded by Alexander the Great, and still is an important city in northern Egypt. Now, many Jews had settled there over previous centuries, and it was a seat of Greek and Hebrew learning. It had a huge library of, at its peak, 400,000 scrolls. And many years before, the Greek translation of the scriptures had been created there, called the Septuagint. Now, he was learned, meaning that he was cultured, he was eloquent and highly educated. And when he arrived at Ephesus, he displayed another qualification. He was intimately acquainted with the Word of God and had an extraordinary gift and power in teaching it. Well, what did he know? We know that he was instructed in the way of the Lord, but it mentions he only knew about John's teaching of baptism. Despite his many gifts and talents, he had received only an elementary introduction in the gospel. He knew the Messiah, he knew about John's baptism of repentance, but not the baptism in the name of Jesus, of his dying and rising again with Jesus and the fullness of the new covenant. But despite that, despite what he didn't know, he was enthusiastic. In fact, the word is actually much stronger than enthusiastic. It literally says his spirit boiled. And he didn't let his enthusiasm carry him away with him, because sometimes people get a bit carried away when they get enthusiastic and say things which perhaps aren't necessarily wise or sensible to say. But it says he taught the scriptures accurately. He accurately expounded what the scriptures said rather than he wanted them to say. The Bible isn't a set of texts just to hang messages and sermons on, but something we must understand exactly what it's trying to tell us. Now, as we said, he needed and would benefit from further instruction. And we see a remarkable display of tact and wisdom by Aquila and Priscilla. Instead of actually confronting him publicly in the church, they invite him to their house, to their home. And they talk about things privately. And they have the grace to avoid any public confrontation or shaming. And we see grace in Apollos as well, because despite his education, his learning, he's willing to learn from these two tradespeople. And we find that it is good for everyone. Everyone wins in this. Apollos becomes an even greater preacher. And actually, Aquila and Priscilla are content to remain in the background. So in verse 27 and 28, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed. For he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. So Apollos wanted to go actually where Paul had just come from, back to Corinth. And the church at Ephesus were wholehearted in their support of him. They could have said, well, Apollos, there's so much you could do here. We've invested so much in you here. You really must stay. But they were there to encourage him. They recognised they had no control over Apollos and that God might have purposes for him, that God might have other avenues for him. And so that they not only encouraged him in his leaving, they actually gave him a good word to the people he was going to, so that when he got to Corinth, he proved a tower of strength to the church there, teaching to the church inside and witnessing to those around them. And we see his apologetics were formidable and unstoppable against the Jewish opponents there. The interesting thing is when we read Corinth, the 1 Corinthians, we hear of these factions, and Apollos is named as one of the factions, but Apollos never thought of himself as a competitor to Paul, and Paul never thinks of Apollos as a competitor to him. He always speaks warmly of him as an appreciated colleague, a partner, not someone he's in competition with. He speaks of him planting and Apollos watering. And it makes us realise that we're not in competition with each other in God's work. We're all partners together of it. And each one of us might have a role and a different stage of someone who comes to Christ's life. We aren't the only ones who saves them. We may be one in a long line of people God has used who've made instrumental in their salvation. So in conclusion, as I promised earlier, we didn't encounter any most important or extraordinary event. And perhaps if you think that I've missed it, I'd be happy to hear from you. But I dare say for most of us, we've never heard this preached on before. But it teaches things to us that we don't often discuss because they seem so ordinary, they seem so normal. And yet for that very reason, it's all the more important for us to know about the ordinary things of the Christian life because that makes up most of our normal lives. So 3 lessons on the ordinary. Growing as Christians. When we read that Paul travelled to Galatia, his purpose was to strengthen the disciples, to spiritually equip them, to help them grow in faith and grace and knowledge. The question was, how did he do that? Was it special meetings? Was it a special ceremony? In fact, it seems quite ordinary. Some might say even boring. He taught them what they needed to know and reminded them of what they already knew. It was a spiritual and an intellectual process of instruction. And through that, he encouraged them and strengthened them. And actually, we have the very same tools at our disposal nowadays. We have the very same equipment in our scriptures. And it's up to us really how we handle that. When we're taught, we take the view that I know everything. A little story of a relative who, at the age of 5, announced to his aunt that he knew everything. And when his aunt announced to him that she wasn't really quite sure whether that was true, expressed with great exasperation, "But I do, Auntie, I do." Now, I'm sure none of us believe we know everything. We might think we know everything that we need to know and don't need to know anymore. But we can also say, well, we can always learn, even if it means changing our minds on things. John Owen was called Prince of the Theologians in the 17th century, and I have a quote which I've never been able to find again, where he said, There are few people who haven't changed their minds in the last 15 years, and I'm not one of them. So even a great man like that, in the light of knowledge, the things, learning, we sometimes have to change our mind and our outlook. Now, growing together as Christians, that's another lesson. It takes more grace than tongue can tell to play the second fiddle well. That's one of those things where it's hard to be in the background. It's hard to be ordinary. We saw in our passage Christian grace in action, which sees the best in people, recognises the gifts and seeks their best, and yet always manages to stay in the background. We could easily imagine how this could have gone quite differently. We have a gifted and eloquent teacher arrives at the synagogue. He's invited to preach. He's charismatic. He's on fire. He knows so much stuff. But it's clear he hasn't quite got everything right. And there's an established and well-respected couple in the church hear him and quickly find fault. They feel a bit threatened that he knows all this stuff, and they publicly criticise and denounce him. Now, Apollos is upset by it all and goes, probably takes half the church with him, and you don't need to know very much to appreciate this has happened many times in the history of the church. But that is not what Priscilla and Aquila do. They recognise his great gifts. They're happy to acknowledge that he knows more than they do in many areas. But they have no jealousy. And they rejoice that God has brought him among them. There's no pride or resentment. And so they carefully teach him the things that he just didn't know. No fault of his own. And it was no reflection on him. But he just didn't know them. And so he told them that. And we have what is emerged, a greater and more effective Apollos going to Corinth. My last point is this. We live in a society where ordinary is one of the loneliest words in the dictionary. Who wants to be an ordinary person in an ordinary village in a small and very ordinary church? But the passage that we have read is very much God working in the sphere of the ordinary. In our passage, we don't read of visions and miracles and prophecy and spectacular events. Paul is going about his business as normal. We read of his preaching, his witnessing, his keeping promises, his building up of young Christians by teaching. We read of him working at a trade, the great apostle, at making and repairing leather goods. We see him keeping a deadline, needing to reach a destination by a certain date. Yet all of the time, he is in God's path, doing God's will. And God is with him just as much as when he is involved in doing what could be classed of those things of greater importance. Now, all of us lead ordinary lives, and most of our time is spent doing ordinary things. And yet God, if we are Christians, is with us, even in our most normal and ordinary circumstances, and can and will use and presence himself with us in them. Is God only with us is when we're at church or at a Christian conference or in our quiet time or at prayer or reading his word or doing things which you consider spiritual? No, he's with us at all times, in ordinary activities, as much in the times we would consider as spiritual things. There is no dividing line between the two. There's no firewall between our Christian experience and our normal life. It is our normal activities, our ordinary activities, doing things that perhaps we don't enjoy. We find wearisome, tiring, and hard and difficult than the most testing, when we can either glorify God or dishonour him. And Paul, in his epistles, doesn't leave us guessing of what he expects from us in our normal lives. He's brutally honest to us in the epistles of what true Christian behaviour should be in these times. So when we leave this building, if we are Christians, remember God is still with us. We don't leave him behind here, and will be with us for the rest of this week in every part of our lives.